In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Well, hello, Sublation media viewers and readers. We have changed the topic for this stream. We're not going to be talking about technocracy today and neo-feudalism, but instead about Israel and Gaza and the recent violence and conflict there. I'm Douglas Lain. I'm the novelist behind Batch Batch Revolution, the former publishing manager of Zero Books, and now the publisher and CEO of Sublation Media.
And I'm Ashley Frawley. I'm Associate Professor of Criminology, Sociology, and Social Policy at Swansea University, though for a limited time only. I will be moving to the University of Kent in the Center as a visiting researcher in the Center for Parenting Culture Studies. I'm a sociologist and I specialize in social problems. And so that gives me a pretty wide remit. And although I have to say that today's subject matter is pretty well outside of my remit, it's probably one of the more complex issues of international relations, and I definitely have to admit my ignorance, which is why we have some guests here today to help us through, to make sense of what's going on and answer the question, should we choose a side?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking, we're going to be running a pre-recorded interview with Fakhry Al-Serdawi, who is a Palestinian writer. He's a contributor to Sublation magazine. He's an anti-nuclear activist, and he's a Palestinian. And we're going to begin with that. Then we have Daniel Ben Ami, who's going to be talking about the conflict as well. He recently wrote an article for Spiked magazine, and we'll be discussing that with the situation with him. And then we have Helen Rollins, who's going to be talking about Northern Ireland as perhaps a parallel example of what a peace process looks like when you have an occupied or an oppressed people fighting a war of terrorism and guerrilla warfare against a major power, and how that was resolved in the 90s, or to what degree it was resolved then. The goal of this stream is to insist upon thinking rather than merely cheerleading in any direction. Just wanted to make that point. It doesn't serve any purpose, from my perspective, to slip into a moralistic response or tribal response, or to hold on to delusions about possibilities. And instead try to look reality in the face with sober senses and critically. So with that in mind, I'd like to just go right away to the interview with Fakhry Al-Serdawi, and then we'll be back with Daniel Ben Ami.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doug. My name is Fakhry Al-Serdawi. I specialize in international relations and in nuclear disarmament, especially as a researcher. I'm a lawyer also. We had an interview last time on something that is relevant, which is terrorism, counterterrorism. We're going to be talking about that more. I was born in the West Bank. My family is still there. Now I'm abroad, only in a temporary manner. And that would be me in a nutshell. I am unable at this moment to take a cold historical approach to the conflict because I'm too close to it. If there's one imperfection of Marxism, is that we cannot ask people to take a cold historical approach. We cannot ask anyone who's close, for example, if there's a mass shooting in the US, we can analyze it and we can say that it comes in a boring dystopia, but we cannot tell the families of the victims that to take a cold historical approach. what I'm gonna ask from leftists who are watching this channel is that I'm not gonna ask them to become pro-Palestinian. I'm gonna ask them, can you take a cold historical approach on my behalf? This is what I'm gonna ask right now. And unfortunately, this is not what's happening right now. Of course, my experience with it is that I was completely surprised by what happened, because what I understood for years about Hamas is that it was an organization that is based upon strategic patience. First of all, we thought it was a normal skirmish, what happened. Then we started receiving more and more news about the complete collapse of the border situation between Israel-controlled territories and Hamas, in between Gaza, and that made me think about that. First of all, it was a complete failure to anticipate this from the Israeli authorities. A complete collapse of security and military situation there by what is supposed to be the most powerful army in the Middle East, which raises a lot of questions. What had happened? Now, instead of thinking about who was responsible for that within the Israeli government, we are going into civilizational discourses, which I'm going to talk about that more later on. What happened was that Hamas went deeply inside Israeli territory, capturing some points, and it's a complete military operation. It's not a lone wolf attack or a limited coordinated attack. I don't know why this happened. I know historically, materially why this happened. I don't know what the leadership in Hamas is thinking right now. I don't know if there is a strategy behind this. There could be, but it's just more, I don't think so. If there's a long-term strategy behind this. And there were orthodoxies online that were forming around this. Two types of orthodoxies. First, there was a pro-Palestinian orthodoxy that reminded me with Benjamin Studebaker article on Yevgeny Prigozhin approaching Moscow with his forces in the Western Viewer. There was people celebrating what was happening because to understand the left, whether in the US or whether outside in the Middle East, 1967 Six-Day Wars came along a year before 68, and before the neoliberal regime was applied in the Middle East. So many people are connecting finding new historical possibilities with the military defeat of Israel. Some military defeat, it could be a total or non-total. So it's not about that they're bloodthirsty or they're anti-Semites. Now, of course, if you ask a Marxiologist, he will tell you that this approach is wrong and there should be a multifaceted way of finding new historical possibilities at the end of history. This is why some people are celebrating this as leftists. The other thing is the left has to take a cold historical approach anti-establishment dissident, even on the right, has to take a quote historical approach. We cannot afford to lose our minds over this the same way we're losing our minds over the Ukraine. The EU, the US, Australia, so on and so forth, are adapting to the Borg mind of condemning it and all of this and all of that, all those liberal technocrats. We should not be acting like them. We should be thinking about this more. And I sent you my tweet on this. Is that unfortunately some anti-establishment populists are acting in a similar manner, similar mass hysteria to what liberal technocrats have acted about Ukraine almost 2 years ago. And the thing is that what happened is I don't think it's gonna go well. I think that there could be an invasion. A lot of people are gonna die, mostly on the Palestinian side. It's not something for us to faint about and lose our minds about. It's something for us to take a cold historical approach to it and know why it happened. We can agree that in the past 48 hours, Israel was defeated. And I say that because I don't want to talk about defeatism. It was a surprise attack. In 1967, there was a similar surprise attack, the 6 Days War. And there was some Marxist defeatism, above all Sadiq Jalal Adem, who said that the nascent nation of Japan has defeated the Tsarist Russia, which led the way to the October Revolution. And he was very defeatist about the Arab secular regime. All what came after that was a horror show until now. So this is why I am not an enthusiast about anti-Israeli defeatism, that it could make changes within the Israeli regime, or it could, we can decolonize and liberalize, as they are saying online. So I don't know what kind of horror show is coming next. But it's not going to be socialism. It's not going to be the October Revolution. It could be, I hope I'm wrong, but it's not.
Okay, so that conversation with Fakhry Al-Serdawi was 45 minutes or so long. I'm going to make that available later today after the stream in the Parrot Room or on Patreon, and I will also probably be releasing the entirety of it publicly in the next few days. But just to sum up, I think that what I experienced most during that conversation was how seriously Fakhry was taking the situation and how he was struggling to think it through rather than simply react. And he's in a position to be able to do that, although he's also asking for all of us who are far away from the conflict, don't have friends and relatives involved, to be even colder and more thoughtful and more reflective about it. So, Ashley, do you want to introduce our next guest? Go ahead.
To think a little bit more about this, we have Daniel Ben-Ami on the sorry, on the podcast tonight. And actually, I didn't realize this, but Daniel has written an article in Spiked today, that's come out today, titled "This is not about liberating Palestine. There's no excuse for the left's ignorance about Hamas's genocidal aims." So the editor wasn't mincing any words. So to talk about this, let's welcome Daniel. Hi, thank you so much for joining us on such short notice. First, I wondered what you thought about that interview. Was there anything that stuck out at you as something that you agreed with or disagreed with?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I hope that Fakhry's family are okay. I mean, I understand they're in the West Bank rather than Gaza, and as things stand, the epicenter of the conflict is Gaza, but it could very, very easily spread to the West Bank or other places, which is maybe something we could discuss later on. I mean, the main point in my article, which I think is my main difference with Fakhry, is that I think it's wrong. Most people, understandably, see the conflict at the moment as a conflict between Israel's right to self-determination and Palestinian right to self-determination. And some people will side with Israel, some people side with the Palestinians, some people will say they want to compromise. But I think that's just the wrong way to see it, because I think what's missing is that, in my view, this is a kind of trilateral conflict, not a bilateral conflict. In other words, if you look at Hamas, the Palestinian main Islamist movement in Gaza, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a kind of smaller version of Hamas, their stated goal, so this is not my reading of the situation, their very clearly, avowedly, openly stated goal is to kill Jews, is to be anti-Semitic. You don't need to know Arabic to speak that. Your listeners or viewers can just Google the Hamas Covenant of 1988, which is really their founding document, and it's full of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It very openly quotes, or allegedly quotes, the Prophet Muhammad. I don't know if it's an accurate quote or not, but in their quote, saying that Jews should be slaughtered from a very approving point of view. They've never rescinded that charter. They have had a kind of updated manifesto in 2017. They've never rescinded that charter. Hamas leaders, time and time again, have spoken about wanting to kill Jews. Again, some of this it obviously helps if you speak Arabic, which I don't, but a lot of this has been translated into English. And their goal is clearly bad for Israelis, Israeli Jews, but their goal is not national self-determination for the Palestinians either. They loathe the concept of national self-determination. Their goal is to wipe out Jews in Israel, and that's seen as a transitional goal to what is stated as their ultimate goal as an international Islamic order, or what some people call a caliphate. So from my perspective, I absolutely support the Palestinian right to national self-determination. They absolutely have that right. I also think Israel has the right to defend itself. But I think anyone with any humanity, anyone on the left, should be entirely opposed to Hamas and what they stand for.
Well, I'm going to ask an obvious question, which is when you're looking at a situation like the one in Gaza, where the people there are kept in what's being called an open-air prison, and the political rights and the rights of self-determination that they currently have are so massively constricted, is it a surprise, or is it a predictable consequence of that a far-right religious anti-Semitic movement would take hold as the mode of expression of dissent and resistance, given that nothing more developed or civilized, or nothing that would be aiming at a good end has the conditions to take hold there? I mean, don't we need to call upon the Israelis to start to liberalize Israel, to start a process of integration and allow for the movement of Palestinians to soften rather than harden as a long term? I mean, I know in the moment that's going to sound like a ridiculous suggestion, but isn't that not necessary right now if we want to undermine the power of Hamas and the control that they have?
By coincidence, this is maybe the next article I want to write on precisely this topic, because I think it's an important argument. I mean, I think it's absolutely true that the conditions in Gaza are terrible. I mean, I've not been there for many, many years. Not been safe for me to go. But even when I went many years ago, before Hamas took power, conditions are terrible. There's an awful lot of despair in Gaza. There's no doubt about that. I think Israel bears certainly some of the blame. I don't think entirely. I mean, people forget that Gaza also has a border with Egypt. It's not just bounded by Israel. People forget that Hamas bears some of the blame also. It's a completely autocratic government. It's not Israel that controls, at least internally. It's not Israel that controls Gaza. It's Hamas that controls Gaza. And it's a very, very authoritarian government to its own citizens. So it's not a straightforward matter. But I also don't buy the argument that because you live in terrible conditions, which people in Gaza certainly do, that necessarily means it's okay for you to go out and slaughter Israeli civilians. You still have choices. You can do other things. You can protest in other ways. Of course, it's very difficult for them, but there are other things you can do. Living in a kind of terrible condition in Gaza with, I don't know, electricity perhaps 8 hours a day and now 4 hours a day with the power cuts, with very, very low standards of living, certainly compared to Israel next door. It's very, very difficult, subject to bombing sometimes. But even that those terrible conditions do not force you to go out and slaughter 260 Israelis in a raid near the border with Gaza. People have moral culpability. And it completely, the argument actually dehumanizes Palestinians to think that they don't have choices, even living in the most terrible conditions, which those in Gaza do. They still have choices about what they do. And the people in the West who make excuses for that and say it's okay, I think that's entirely unforgivable.
Well, I mean, I don't feel like I'm in a position, or anyone in the West right now is in a position to, I mean, look, if we were going to move from politics to justice, we're going to be talking about creating enough stability in the region to actually, charge people with war crimes or other kinds of crimes, arrest them, give them due process. If we're going to talk about on the this on the level of individual morality, that's the level where we settle these things. We don't settle these things on that level when it comes to military actions, aid to states, policy. We don't say, well, could this mass of people have done better as individuals or not? And if we think they could have done better, then we're going to punish them with military action. And if we don't think they could have done better, we won't. That's just not how politics works. So the question for us as agents, not to dehumanize the Palestinians, is what do we, especially on the left, want to do? What should we be calling for to improve the possibility of basic rights being established and a better world being possible? Like, what, as a Marxist, what I want to say is, how can we, push the project of socialism in this moment, and where are the opportunities for that? I don't see many, or if any, right now. But that's where I'm coming from. Now, Ashley, I'll stop antagonizing him and let you to ask questions.
Well, no, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that, but my question sort of follows on from that. You write in this article that one thing that Hamas has what you've just said, is no interest in securing this national self-determination for the Palestinian people. That would certainly be a worthy cause, but what Hamas really wants is to destroy Israel. It sees this as an essential step towards creating an international Islamic order. Now, our commenters are fighting amongst each other. Our viewers right now are fighting amongst each other, where some people are saying, well, of course, Israel is a Jewish nation and it's oppressing them. So of course they would identify their oppressors of the Jews. It's justified. And someone else is saying, you people who are justifying the slaughter of Israelis are sick, and people just can't. We've got a leftist audience here, so there's a lot of uncertainty. But certainly, when I was looking at the reaction just online, and I was watching the news today, and there was a demonstration outside of the Labour Party conference that Labour was quite keen to distance themselves from. But there's huge amount of uncertainty about this. But it seems like the obvious leftist position was to defend Hamas. And I wondered, is it just because there isn't an awareness? Or is there kind of something deeper going on with a kind of what Israel symbolizes for the left?
Well, I think on one level it is extremely simple. I mean, and you can overcomplicate it. Hamas says in its charter, and is repeated time and time again, that its goal is to slaughter Jews. What it did over the weekend, from its perspective, from its war perspective, was to slaughter Jews. And you would think that anyone on the left, whatever they think, they can make other points about Israel and be critical of Israel and Israeli policy towards Gaza. That's fine. But you'd think on that point, anyone remotely on the left, anyone with some kind of humanity, would condemn the slaughter of Jews outright. I mean, anti-Semitism does have a pretty bad history for good reason, and you'd think people would stand up against it. I mean, in terms of what people can do, obviously it's very difficult for us. I mean, I'm in London. You're sitting in other places. It's very difficult for us to think of solutions, or we can kind of think of solutions in the abstract, but in terms of what's meaningful, it's much more difficult. I've never, ever been one to say, I want a one-state solution, I want a two-state solution, I want a socialist solution, because I think it's self-determination means it's up to the people in the region, including Palestinians, including Israelis, to decide what kind of society that they want. It's not really up to us. I think what we should be doing in the West, I think we should be opposing anti-Semitism. And it's notable that whenever you have this kind of conflict in the Middle East, you tend to have a flare-up of anti-Semitism in Western countries. So you have had in Berlin, in London, I mean, this is only a small number of people, but still significant, people cheering and celebrating the fact that Israelis have been slaughtered. So I think in the West, we should be standing up against anti-Semitism. I also think we should be opposing Islamism. Reading about Islamism, as I said, you don't need to learn Arabic. I mean, it helps if you know Arabic or Farsi, which I don't, but you can read about it in English to learn about it. People should make themselves aware of it. And absolutely support the Palestinian right to self-determination. That's fine. And if people want to criticize Israel from the kind of normal criteria that they would criticize any other nation, again, that's fine. I have no problem with that at all.
Well, I want to raise something that from what Fakhry had said to get your response to it. One of the things he mentioned was that he was against defeatism, and what he meant by that was there's this idea that anything that defeats an imperial power, any attack upon or attempt to wipe out the power of capital and imperialism both, should be supported. That what's necessary is for, regardless of who is acting, is for that power to be checked. It's an old idea. You could see it on the left during the Vietnam War, and you could see it again and again, where the left's response to the abuses that comes from U.S. foreign power or from Israeli foreign power or any part of, let's say, the NATO world, is to wish for the defeat of the who they see as the aggressor, as if that will bring forward an opportunity for a new form of power based on working class power and the rights of people, the people, as if that will create a moment for that to emerge. And he was opposed to that. He did not think that the fact that Israel was defeated would lead to a good end, because he said, for a moment, Israel was defeated. But what he also was concerned about was the very perspective that I think you just expressed, which was that this will be seen as a struggle between civilizations or ideologies. And the reason that, obviously you don't want to embrace an anti-Semitic party if you're part of the left. You don't want to pretend that defeatism is true. But on the other hand, you don't want to create conditions for your own state to start imposing draconian measures of oppression against you. And I would be concerned that just like after the war on, the attacks of September 11th, and with the beginning of the war on terror, that just as that gave the U.S. state the ability to create a state of exception and take away basic civil liberties at home, that we might be facing something similar now. That the concerns about anti-Semitism can be transformed into an intensification of the war on disinformation and hate speech, which end up being a way to limit political organizing and political expression in the United States. So what do you make of that problem?
Well, yeah, I mean, sure, it's possible that in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, governments in Britain or America could take draconian measures, and if that happens, then I think they should be opposed. But it doesn't follow that anti-Semitism is not a real problem. I mean, I don't think it's the majority, anything like the majority of people in America or Britain or Germany. But I think there's a section within the Muslim community, so not at all the majority, probably a small minority, but a section that supports Islamism. And by Islamism, I really mean a kind of anti-modern political movement. And I think those people do tend to be anti-Semitic. And I think there's obviously the far right, which is usually pretty marginal, but is anti-Semitic. But there's a section in the left, which I think, although it usually eschews obviously anti-Semitic language in the old kind of sense, they've also moved towards anti-Semitism. So these are minority movements in Western societies, but I think they do need to be opposed by anyone who believes in freedom. And maybe if I could add one more thing, one peculiarity of Israel, and this view actually developed out of the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union is obviously dead and mainly unlamented. But in the Soviet Union, there was a discipline called Zionology. And what the Soviet Zionologists did, they didn't want to appear to be overtly anti-Semitic. So they developed this idea that Israel was the kind of epitome of evil. So that Israel, the whole idea that Israel epitomizes secular colonialism, racism, apartheid, imperialism, fascism. Israel is the epitome of all of these things. Was really developed to a large extent in the Soviet Union. Also, the equation of Israel with Nazi Germany, which is completely obscene and ridiculous if you know anything about Nazi Germany. These kind of emerged out of the Stalinist tradition to a large extent. And they helped create the basis for contemporary left-wing anti-Semitism. I'm not saying all left-wing people are anti-Semitic, but I think there is an element of that. And it's really, really important to stand up against it too, I think.
Some of the comments are getting angrier and angrier, but I keep trying to sort of split my attention. Is a problem that we constantly have on this show when we're talking to each other, and we're trying to also, this is an opportunity for our viewers to ask questions of us as well. So we kind of have to pay attention to both. But one of the things that came up is that that I've noticed as well is that there's the beginnings of conspiratorial thinking, which I'm sure you've seen, that Israel, someone commented, this is Israel's 9/11. And another commenter said, it is. And in the same way that the US let the Twin Towers get hit, so did Israel allow this. And I wonder, well, I suppose the sane question that comes out of that is, what's the role of this, the connection of this, if any, to international conflicts and, you know, the role of other countries like the United States? And then the less sane question is, I don't know, what do you think about these conspiracy theories?
Well, in terms of the geopolitics, there's all sorts of discussions about this. And I think people often express their opinions very firmly, but it's hard to be sure about what's going on. I mean, one element that people argue is that Israel, I mean, it's pretty clear, I don't think this is controversial, that Israel seems to be becoming close to normalization with Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's all sorts of over talk about this, you know, both on the Israeli side and on the Saudi side. But then Saudi Arabia and Israel, of course, are enemies of Iran, whereas Hamas is allied to Iran. So there is a kind of, not a conspiracy theory in itself, but a discussion of, well, maybe Iran helped to prompt this attack or back this attack because it wanted to break up the emerging normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I mean, that could be true, maybe not, but that's a kind of the big geopolitical discussion. In terms of conspiracy theories, I mean, I think they are becoming stronger for reasons that I think we've discussed before, and they're nothing per se to do with Israel or Jews. I think because people feel disenfranchised from politics in general, you know, in Germany, America, Britain, one way people interpret that, I think wrongly, is through conspiracy theories. You know, that they're dominated by these kind of shadowy kinds of forces that they have no control over. So it must be some kind of giant conspiracy. And then I think those conspiracy theories often lend themselves to anti-Semitism. So I don't think the conspiratorial mindset originates with anti-Semitism in many cases. There are other reasons for external to Jews or the conflict in the Middle East, but they do lend themselves to anti-Semitism, I think, once that mindset is established.
So here's a conspiracy theory, which I've heard floating about, which is that in some way, this attack may be connected to the situation in Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine, and the escalating tensions between NATO and the United States and China and Russia. That perhaps the arming of the Hamas and Gaza was facilitated by Russian aid through Iran or in some other way. What do you think this might say about the overall situation, not just between Gaza and Israel, but the rising tensions in the world and the possibility of a global conflict?
I mean, obviously, people can draw all sorts of things out of conspiracy theories. I mean, I haven't seen any evidence of significant Russian involvement in relation to Gaza. I mean, the players seem to be Iraq and Qatar on one side, then Israel and Saudi Arabia, who are nominally kind of enemies, but often have quite close relations on the other side. So I don't really see that, but there is another aspect of which we haven't really discussed, which is the possibility of the conflict spreading. So it could be to the West Bank, or it could be Lebanon, because you have Hezbollah, which is another, or Hezbollah, how you pronounce it in English, the Lebanese Party of God, as it's called in Arabic, which is much more militarily powerful than Hamas. It's got loads and loads of missiles, quite heavily armed, backed by Iran. The possibility of that attacking Israel on its northern front, and you could even have a situation, I mean, this is getting a bit speculative, of Israel sending ground troops into Gaza, and then Hezbollah taking advantage of that and then attacking Israel from the north. And I think that possibility, I mean, none of these things are definite, and I'm not saying it's a conspiracy that this would definitely happen, but I think that probably explains why America has just sent a carrier group to the Eastern Mediterranean, because it's seems to be trying to warn Hezbollah and Syria as well, which backs it, not to get involved in that, to hold back from getting involved in the conflict. There's been a little bit so far. So Hezbollah has shelled Shaba Farms, which is an area on Israel's border with Lebanon that is controlled by Israel, but it's disputed territory. So there's been a little bit of shelling, I think, just kind of testing the waters by Hezbollah. But yeah, I think that's more of a possibility, that you could have the northern front exploding, I mean, figuratively and literally, which would make it, I mean, it's already a very, very serious conflict, but could make it a much more serious conflict.
Well, thank you for participating in the stream and for coming on to express your views. I want to encourage people to check out your article on Spiked at Spiked, and we will, after the stream is over, we'll put a link to it in the description, along with the link to the Parrot Room discussion. I want to bring in Helen Rollins here to talk about, Daniel, you're free to stick around and participate if you'd like, or if you have, I know your time is limited, so it's up to you. But Helen, I wanted to begin just by explaining to you and to the audience why we asked you to come on to talk about Northern Ireland right now, rather than, and it's just kind of an intuition that I have here more than anything. It came out of a chat on Facebook, and Alfie was a part of it, and it arose as with people who are connected to Sublation, the main crew, were trying to get a grip on why this is happening now, what some of the possible remedies might be. And one of the things that emerged as we discussed it was the fact that what precipitated the softening of the conflict and the move towards peace in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, was economic growth throughout the 90s. And I'm wondering if you can see a parallel between the situation in Palestine and Israel and Northern Ireland in the UK, and if I'm correct to say that the one of the factors, along with the ending of the Cold War, was the economic growth that Ireland overall and Northern Ireland experienced in the 90s.
Yeah, I would agree that that's a massive factor. So first of all, yeah, I don't know how much of an expert I am on you know, the Troubles, and I just hope that I don't get anything wrong in the eyes of my fellow people of Northern Ireland. So I can only kind of contribute as far as, you know, I'm capable. I think I was about like 9 years old during when the peace process happened. So it's a long time ago in my lifetime, but I do remember what it was like before, etc. But I do obviously know that in the 90s as a child, was much difficult, much more different than in the 70s, for example. But you know, it is a huge factor, and obviously discussions of, for example, the unification of Ireland are ongoing and potentially getting more popular in some ways, but in other ways there are sort of issues to confront there. And one of the reasons why Northern Ireland is so stable is because of the financial support that it is given, and the living standards there, the quality of life. It's a small economy, a small community, so there aren't huge amounts of opportunities per se compared to international cities and stuff like that. But a huge amount of money, government money, is put into Northern Ireland compared to the rest of the UK, for example. And you know, obviously the motivation to you know, enter into conflict is just not there. And the standard of living obviously changed in Northern Ireland hugely from, you know, the 60s, 70s to the 90s. Obviously now we're in a very precarious state globally in terms of economics. And interestingly, in terms of the unification of Ireland, Ireland is, the Republic is sort of, you know, near the center of some of the global issues of international finance, capital mobility, corporations not being taxed. So that is a big factor that's not often talked about today. As things do get more precarious, you know, there are flare-ups of violence. There've been one or two like very small events in recent years. One that was, I shouldn't say the word small because it was horrendously tragic, a young journalist who was killed a few years ago in a stray bullet situation in Derry. But yeah, I mean, obviously economics play a huge role.
Was the peace dividend after the Cold War that the UK put together spent to some degree on Northern Ireland? Do you know? Is that?
I do not know that. No,
Yeah,
but I do know that there's a sort of way in which government financing is distributed in the UK. Northern Ireland is a very small population, 1.8 million people. So the amount of money that goes to Northern Ireland relatively to the rest of the UK, you know, it isn't a huge dent in the overall government budget, but a huge amount of financing does go in. And, you know, the quality of life in Northern Ireland is very good. Historically, not so for many portions of the population. And there, you know, it's not like it's Britain itself, you know, in many ways is now a poor country with some international money in it and a few rich people. So I do wonder where things are going to go, because obviously talking about economic issues, will people be motivated to leave the UK, or will the UK's position as it sort of dwindles economically affect Northern Ireland? But there is, you know, the issue on the other side of the border with what the right-wing government of the Republic of Ireland has done in terms of international corporate finance and capital mobility. And it's something that's not really talked about that much, because, you know, there are obviously the cultural issues related to identity groups, and often that sort of, in the Northern Ireland context, doesn't lead on to a wider discussion about economics and that kind of thing. Things tend to be kind of very reactive, way less so now. I mean, when you talk to people who are my age or under the age of 30, you know, these issues of the conflict just seem so foreign to people. But it, you know, it is relatively recent. 1998 is not that long ago. It's 25 years ago. But it is, you know, and Northern Ireland in some ways is a miracle. So I'm not saying, you know, I am not an expert on, you know, the Middle East or what's going on at the moment in Israel and Palestine. Obviously, you know, there is this notion that there is an example of a peace process that worked. And I'm sure that there are elements of the philosophy and the strategy behind the peace process that made it, you know, exceptional. But I do think that there are lots of factors going on at the time. As you know, as you say, Doug, the 90s were a different moment to today.
The IRA, tell me about the character, the ideological character of the IRA. To what degree did Catholicism and religious ideology play a role in that and the Troubles, and how did the IRA change character throughout the process of softening up and or go ahead?
So there, again, I'm not an expert, but there are multiple different factions, and you know, a huge amount of conflict within different Republican groups. So the more kind of, I don't know if you call it historical IRA, maybe would have more of a left-wing character, and there are different factions that, you know, were disowned on, you know, hugely by many Republican groups that would be more extreme. I can't really speak to the ideological, you know, approach. Obviously, what's going on in the Middle East is different, and religion plays a stronger part. I mean, Northern Ireland, obviously, nominally you have the religious dimension, but really, I mean, the origin of the Troubles is so complicated as well, and very, very interesting. And, you know, it sort of, in a way, a fallout of civil rights. So the early, you know, you have the civil rights movements that are happening sort of the late 60s, 67, 68, then a sort of backlash that occurred in the more religious, conservative, unionist side of things, so Ian Paisley, etc. And then there was a threat to the Catholic population because of that sort of stirring up of a cultural fear about what civil rights would lead to. And the British Army was brought in originally to protect the Catholic population from violent attacks from the unionist side. And obviously, you know, civil rights is a brilliant aspiration, and, you know, characterized a lot of the aspects of demands on the Republican side. But that's not, you know, there are lots of different factions, and as things escalate, you know, the dimensions of oppositional binary thinking, racializing, that kind of thing become stronger and stronger. But that, you know, doesn't characterize you know, a lot of the different motivations on. I mean, it's a very complicated conflict. And, you know, I think, Daniel, you said about it, you know, a trilateral, I can't remember how many laterals you're talking about, but definitely it wasn't a bilateral conflict by any means in Northern Ireland. You also have, you know, the way in which there was a US involvement informally. You know, the British kind of side of things, it's very complicated, and then the sort of antagonism between Westminster and the kind of the Unionists, as well as Westminster and the Republicans, and then the different, you know, aspects of it, you know, the fog of war, right? You know, things get very, very complex and complicated. I mean, obviously.
I want to ask, when you say it's complicated, do you mean that in Northern Ireland there were conflicts internally that played a role, as well as the conflict between Ireland and the UK? And then maybe Daniel, is there something similar, if that's the case, happening in Gaza? But go ahead, Helen.
I was just going to say, because Ireland and the UK, I don't know, that wasn't really the conflict and the Troubles. Ireland wasn't part of it. So,
well, I mean, Northern Ireland, right?
Yeah,
but yeah.
But definitely, I mean, by the end of the Troubles, I mean, the infiltration in terms of the security forces, like almost universally in militant organizations that were purportedly, you know, fighting against Britain, you know, it was a sort of mess by the end in many ways. But yeah, I don't know what Daniel has to say about that.
Well, I certainly don't claim to be an expert on Northern Ireland. I have what in most respects is a disadvantage, but in a few respects is an advantage of being older than Helen. Mostly bad, but one or two advantages in that I do remember the discussion in the late 80s, early 90s with the end of the Cold War, because that was, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was perceived to be a real defeat by a lot of radical movements, even movements that didn't necessarily consider themselves socialist. So at that time, there was the, in relation to the Palestinians, it was more nationalist movements that were to the fore. In Ireland, of course, you had the IRA, which was a kind of nationalist movement. And then what we haven't discussed, and maybe makes it too complicated, is South Africa. So you had all of these shifts. You know, you had the Northern Ireland Accords, you had the end of apartheid in South Africa. And in relation to Israel and the Palestinians, you had the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, which were meant to be a step towards bringing peace, but of course completely failed. So those three examples, the Oslo Accords were the ones that most clearly failed to do what they supposedly were meant to do. I do have a question for Helen, if that's okay, which is, if you look at Northern Ireland today in 2023, and you look at the different communities, Protestant, Catholic communities, I mean, I understand, obviously, they're not at war, they're not fighting each other. Completely understand that. But to what extent are those communities integrated, or is there still a real kind of psychological and physical divide between them?
You know, there is a huge amount of integration. You know, in terms of education, that was a massive push for that, for combining sort of schools and that kind of thing. You know, you do have, you just drive through Belfast, you know, you have flags of all kinds, and it gets very meta because you have a flag representing one group, and then a flag, you know, one side identifies with Palestine, one side identifies with Israel, and then, you know, the unexpected side might identify with another. It all gets very sort of, you know, complicated. Immigration has sort of changed things, because a lot of the areas that were maybe more hardline are often where people from, you know, conflict zones, often like Syria, are kind of brought in to live. There is sort of I mean, in terms of, interesting what you were saying about like the Soviet kind of side in terms of the end of the Soviet Union. My dad has friends, I mean, who were in the IRA, who actually were, you know, fighting for Russia and Afghanistan and sort of as tank commanders, that kind of thing at certain points. So, you know, it's kind of crazy. But you know, in terms of ethically or like spiritually or philosophically or whatever, in terms of the change that happened towards the peace process, was this sort of feeling amongst the population of Northern Ireland that it just wasn't worth it anymore, that the conflict was too much. So obviously, when you get to that point in a conflict, subsequent to that, this desire to move on takes more of a precedent than sort of the identitarian stuff. You know, one of the big aspects of the peace process was recognition and also acceptance, which is very easy to kind of say when conflict is such an intense point as it is in Israel and Palestine. But recognition is an interesting one, because identity politics, right, is something that has really dominated cultural and political life in the last sort of 10 years. Things have got more precarious, and as people have become more desperate in their conditions. And this is like a tale as old as time. The scapegoat mechanism allows you to sort of deal with cathartically your material conditions, and to imagine that on the other side of the scapegoat is a world where the difficulties of today don't exist. But so identity politics we can critique on many levels, as in the ways it's ineffectual, in the ways it distracts from material politics towards sort of a cultural politics. But at the same time, recognition is extremely important, and psychoanalytically recognition, and I don't know how Hegelian we are or whatever, but like it's just so important in terms of a sense of existence in the world, and we don't actually have a sense of self without being recognized in the eyes of another. So I do think recognition played a massive role in Northern Ireland. And as I said, Northern Ireland is very different in so many ways to Israel and Palestine. Obviously, people are living in the same area. And I know in Israel there are Arabs living in Israel, but obviously Gaza is sort of a separate area. But recognition, like cultural recognition, was a hugely important thing. So the promotion of the Irish language, the promotion of Ulster Scots, which is the language of, the Protestant settlers historically, and these things have become like really appreciated within the culture, and not necessarily an indication that, if you speak the Irish language, you are, pro whatever. On the other hand, and I think the thing is, in terms of the kind of maybe identitarian aspect that still kind of exists, and, this is a sort of maybe a dynamic that you see all over the West in terms of in Britain, the way people approached people who voted for Brexit, for example, or people who voted for Trump, that there are elements of the culture maybe on the unionist side that are seen as less progressive or whatever. And obviously you have the 12th of July, which is the celebration of the Battle of the Boyne, which was the victory of William of Orange in 16 whatever. And, there are incidences which, can be seen as quite, from a kind of couth, I don't know, liberal perspective, quite shocking. If you see these bonfires that happen, from an outsider's perspective, there'll often be like effigies burned and flags burned, which can be quite shocking, and maybe sort of, on a kind of contemporary perspective, speak to kind of what Hillary Clinton might call like deplorable politics or something like that. But, maybe we can also understand that those communities have suffered in their own ways, and, maybe aren't seeing what they're doing in the same light as people who are kind of shocked by it. But at the same time, in Northern Ireland, those things are kind of allowed to happen. And I guess that they're allowed to happen because, it's better to have a bonfire than to, have actual kind of terrorist activities or whatever. But, the significance as well is not necessarily read in the same light as an opponent to the people who engage in those activities might kind of think. But it is interesting because like often in Northern Ireland there's this sort of propensity to think it's all going to kick off again, and whilst there are some indications that at times things can bubble over, like a couple of years ago, I don't know if you remember, there were sort of these photos of young people burning a car that kind of were like, oh my god, and I had my friends sort of phone me up being like, oh my god, it was just like a bunch of kids who didn't have much to do. And a lot of the more hardline militant groups have sort of devolved into kind of organized crime. So there is a sort of like organized crime control over various communities and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this. And as I say, I don't know how far this applies to Israel, Palestine, but it is true that Northern Ireland is a kind of emblem of what what is possible given the right circumstances.
Well, listen, we've come up to about an hour here. I want to thank you both for being on the stream, and I think that even if we can't draw firm conclusions from that comparison right now in this moment, I think it's worthwhile just to try to think about conditions where they did change and why. And
I wanted to just ask to end out the stream before we move to the parrot room, the Patreon section. If Daniel and Helen, if you want to leave our listeners with anything that we've said, we need to think about this situation. And you know, in conflicts, everyone's looking for the good guys. Who are the good guys? How can I get on the side of good? But what do you think people should be thinking about? Daniel, if you wanted to.
Well, I think it's much easier in the case of Israel and the Palestinians to identify the bad guys. I mean, from my perspective, Islamism as a political movement is certainly bad. It should be opposed. And if I'd ask people to do anything, it's just read their own stuff, read what they said themselves. In relation to both Israel and the Palestinians, I support their right to self-determination in both cases. But obviously, there's lots of different individuals in Israel, different political movements, as there are among the Palestinians. I mean, Islamism is not the only trend among the Palestinians. So, yeah, people should try. It's very easy to get emotional about this. Well, I can feel that. Fakhry admitted that. Other people feel that. But as far as possible, to try and be cold and dispassionate and try to really understand what each different side is saying, including the Islamists and the Israelis and the mainstream Palestinians. I think that's really important.
Helen. Go ahead, Helen.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know really if I have any insight, of course, but I mean, I don't know how much we've been able to talk about like historical, nothing happens in a vacuum, and there's a huge history that's extremely complex, and there's also, people living in fear and people living in terrible, terrible, terrible conditions. I think also that war is extremely violent, and it can be very shocking to people who aren't in those situations to see what kind of things happen. But I as I said, I do think, in Israel and Palestine, it's very, very difficult given the conditions that exist for people. And I don't know really what else to say. It's a terrible situation.
Okay, well, thank you both for being on. I want to remind everyone that the interview with Fakhry Al-Serdawi was about 45 minutes to an hour long and will be available in its entirety on the Patreon, and then will be released later. We will obviously be returning to this topic. Some people in the stream have claimed that we chose infamy today. I hope that is not the case. But we will be willing to discuss people's perspective. I mean, the opposite perspective would be that a lot of people are saying that we should be straightforwardly pro-Hamas, just as many are saying, we have to oppose anti-Semitism.
It's very simple. It's very simple.
and everyone's claiming it's very simple. All right, so we'll talk more in the parrot room. Thank you both again
Thank you so much
for coming on, and we'll see you there.